Nevada 1985 cold case solved. Arrest shocks community. The coffee pot was still on when Marla Dean left for her morning shift at the Mineral County Medical Clinic. Her husband Roy had watched her back the Buick out of the gravel driveway at 6:14 in the morning. He remembered the exact time because the news had just come on the radio, and he'd been meaning to get the kitchen clock fixed for a month. She waved at him through the windshield. He waved back. On the seat beside her was a brown paper bag with a turkey sandwich she'd made the night before, because the vending machines at the clinic were always out of everything worth eating by noon. That was October 3rd, 1985, in the town of Hawthorne, Nevada, population 4,700. What happened in the next 11 hours would haunt this desert community for 4 decades. That is not a story about a woman who drove away. That is a story about a predator who had been watching and waiting and choosing. And it would take 39 years, a forensic genealogy database, and a single partial palm print lifted from the door of a tan Dodge pickup to finally attach a name to what was done to Marla Dean. But before we get to any of that, we have to go back to the beginning. Because to understand what was taken from this community, you first have to understand who Marla was. Hawthorne in 1985 was the kind of Nevada town that people from the outside tended to overlook. There was a naval ammunition depot on the edge of the flats that employed a good quarter of the working population. A Safeway, 2 diners, a bowling alley, and more churches per capita than Las Vegas had casinos. Walker Lake sat at the southern end of town, its surface flat and silver in the mornings. And on weekends in the summer, you'd find half the town fishing its banks with lawn chairs and styrofoam coolers packed with Olympia beer and bologna sandwiches. It was the kind of place where people left their screen doors unlocked because everybody knew everybody, and everybody's business was everybody else's comfort. Marla Dean had lived in Hawthorne her entire 31 years. She'd gone to Mineral County High School, where she'd been the yearbook editor and run the 400-meter relay, and after 2 years at community college in Reno, she'd come back because her mother had gotten sick, and her father wasn't the kind of man who could manage things alone. She became a medical receptionist at the clinic, a job she was genuinely good at and that she treated with the seriousness of a calling. The patients called her by her first name. The doctors called her indispensable. She had a gift for remembering small things, which patients got anxious in the waiting room and needed someone to sit with them, whose appointment was on a wrong day, which elderly man needed a ride home because his daughter was working. She drove that man home herself, on her lunch break, twice a month. At home, Marla and Roy had a beagle named Captain who slept at the foot of the bed, and on Friday nights they drove the 20 miles to Yerington to rent a VH tape from the Western Auto that also inexplicably rented movies because the selection was better than the one at the gas station in town. Marla liked mysteries. She liked knowing how things ended. They'd been married 6 years and were saving for a piece of land outside of town where Roy had always wanted to try raising a few head of cattle. She was, by any measure, exactly the kind of person a small town wraps itself around. And on the morning of October 3rd, 1985, she drove to work in the gray Nevada dawn and was never seen alive again. At 8 a.m., Marla was expected at the front desk of the Mineral County Medical Clinic. By 8:20, the office manager, a woman named Dolores Pacheco, had tried the front desk phone twice and assumed Marla had car trouble somewhere on the 2-lane stretch of highway between town and the clinic. By 9:00, with the waiting room filling up and no sign of Marla and no answer at the Dean residence, Dolores drove the route herself. She found no car. No sign of trouble. At 9:47 a.m., Roy Dean reported his wife missing to the Mineral County Sheriff's Office. He had driven the route twice himself by then, stopped at both gas stations between their house and the clinic, and called every person he could think of. Nobody had seen her. By noon, deputies had located the Buick. It was pulled off the shoulder of State Route 359, approximately 4 miles south of town, with the driver's door left open and the engine off. The brown paper bag with the turkey sandwich was still on the passenger seat. The radio was still set to crow out of Reno. Marla's purse was on the floor. Her keys were in the ignition. There was no sign of struggle inside the vehicle. What there was, found quietly by a deputy named Chester Rivas, was a partial impression in the soft red clay along the shoulder, tire tracks from a second vehicle, wider space than the Buick, consistent with a truck or heavy-duty van. Rivas photographed them. He noted in his report that they appeared fresh, potentially made that morning. And he wrote something else in his notes, a small detail that would not receive attention it deserved for another decade. There was a single smear on the exterior door handle of the Buick, on the passenger side. Something oily, like a mechanic's hand. He swabbed it. The sample was logged. By nightfall, the search had expanded across the flats surrounding Walker Lake. 43 volunteers turned out, including most of Marla's former high school classmates and every off-shift employee from the ammunition depot. Roy Dean walked with them in the dark, calling his wife's name into the empty desert. 3 days later, on October 6th, 2 hunters found Marla's body in a dry wash 11 miles east of the highway, partially concealed beneath a shelf of volcanic rock. She had been murdered. The case was now a homicide investigation, and it was about to become the longest open wound this town had ever carried. The lead investigator assigned to the case was Detective Sergeant Frank Arredondo of the Mineral County Sheriff's Office, a compact, careful man with 20 years on the job and a reputation for not letting things go. He had grown up in the next county over and had married a woman from Hawthorne, and understood intuitively that in a town this size a murder was not something the community could absorb and move past. It had to be solved. It had to be closed. Or it would hollow the place out. Arredondo worked the case with a methodical ferocity. Within the first 2 weeks, he had interviewed 214 people, including every staff member and patient who had visited the clinic in the prior 30 days, every registered sex offender in Mineral County, and every person who had purchased fuel at the 2 gas stations on Route 359 in the week before the murder. He coordinated with the Nevada Division of Investigation to process the physical evidence collected from the crime scene and the Buick. He requested assistance from the FBI field office in Las Vegas. 2 suspects emerged quickly. The first was a man named Dale Weston, a part-time laborer from Mena who had a prior conviction for assault on a woman in California and who had been seen at the gas station on Route 359 the morning of October 3rd. Arredondo interviewed him 3 times. Weston had an alibi, imperfect but corroborated by 2 other men who'd been with him at a job site in Smith Valley by 8:30 that morning. The timeline was tight, but not impossible. Arredondo kept Weston on his list. He just couldn't build enough to move forward. The second was a man whose name came from an anonymous tip, a resident of Hawthorne who told the department that her neighbor had come home late the morning of October 3rd with what looked like mud on his truck, and that he'd acted strange, and that she didn't trust him. Arredondo interviewed that neighbor extensively. He owned a tan Dodge pickup. He was a divorced man who worked at the depot and had no known connection to Marla Dean. His alibi placed him on shift at the ammunition depot from 7:00 a.m. onward. 3 co-workers confirmed it. The depot security logs confirmed it. Arredondo could not shake the neighbor from his mind. But the alibi held. Meanwhile, Roy Dean buried his wife in the Hawthorne Cemetery on October 14, 1985, on a cold afternoon with the wind coming off Walker Lake. 312 people attended. The bowling alley closed for the day. The clinic closed for the day. The diner put a handwritten sign in the window that said simply, "Gone to say goodbye to Marla." Roy went home afterward and sat in the kitchen with Captain on his lap, and the clock on the wall still broken, and didn't know what to do next. Neither, increasingly, did Frank Arredondo. By 1988, 3 years after the murder, the case had not produced an arrest. The FBI had matched nothing from the crime scene evidence to any known offender in the national database. The tire tracks had been typed, but not matched. The oily smear on the Buick's door handle, the sample Deputy Rivas had swabbed that first morning, had been analyzed as a petroleum-based compound consistent with common automotive grease, which narrowed nothing in a county full of mechanics and depot workers. Arredondo retired in 1991. He left the case file in a box in his garage. He took it home deliberately, with the permission of the department, because he told his wife he wasn't finished with it. By 1993, the reward poster in the window of the Safeway had faded to pale yellow, and the ink had gone gray. Nobody took it down. Dolores Pacheco, who had been the first to notice Marla was missing, drove Route 359 every October 3rd and left a jar of wildflowers at the spot where the Buick had been found. She did this for 11 straight years. Roy Dean sold the property they'd been saving for. He sold the Buick. He kept Captain until the dog passed in 1990, and then he got another beagle, a female, and named her Marla because he didn't know what else to do with the name. He never remarried. He joined the Volunteer Search and Rescue Unit in 1989 and spent the next 15 years helping look for other people's missing family members, because he understood that work in a way that needed no explaining to anyone who had been through what he had been through. The children who had been in Marla's church youth group in 1985 were parents themselves by the mid-90s, dropping their own kids at school and wondering occasionally, on the drive back, the radio on, Route 359 visible in the distance, whether anyone would ever know. The man Arredondo had never been able to shake, the neighbor with the tan Dodge pickup, had moved out of Hawthorne in 1989. Nobody had reason to follow him. The case was cold. The leads were gone. And then 2 more decades passed, and the desert held its secret, and the town kept living around the absence. Every case on this channel represents weeks of research, verifying facts, tracking down records, piecing together real lives that deserve better than what happened to them. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth behind stories like this one, take a second to like this video and subscribe, and drop a comment letting us know where in the world you're watching from. Your support is what makes this work possible. Now let's get back to Marla. Then, in the spring of 2024, something happened that no one had anticipated. Because by then, a retired deputy named Chester Rivas, the same man who had knelt in the red clay on October 3rd, 1985, and photographed those tire tracks and swabbed that smear on the passenger door handle, was 81 years old and living in Henderson, Nevada. And he had been reading about forensic genealogy. Chester Rivas had never entirely let go of it either. He had followed the science for years, the same way an amateur astronomer follows telescope technology, not because he expected to use it, but because he wanted to understand what was possible. Forensic genealogy, the process of uploading crime scene data to public ancestry databases and tracing distant relatives back to identify an unknown contributor, had begun producing results in other cold cases in Nevada by 2019. Rivas had written a letter to the Mineral County Sheriff's Office in 2020, suggesting that the evidence from the Dean case be submitted for genealogical analysis. He received a polite acknowledgement. He wrote again in 2022. In the fall of 2023, under the direction of newly appointed Sheriff Diana Loughran, the department partnered with a private forensic genealogy laboratory in Salt Lake City and submitted the biological material from the case, including, critically, the oily smear on the passenger door handle that had been logged in October 1985 and had sat in an evidence box for 39 years. On a Tuesday morning, in March 2024, a forensic analyst named Priya Naveen was working through a set of DNA profiles from legacy cold case evidence when one of the samples returned a network of partial matches in the genealogy database. She flagged it, ran the network analysis, and began tracing the family tree backward through the matching profiles. The process took 6 weeks. It led to a family cluster in western Nevada. It narrowed to a single male individual of the right age who had lived in Mineral County in the 1980s. She called her supervisor. She told him to sit down. The name was Ronald Keith Garrett, formerly of Hawthorne, Nevada, the man who had owned the tan Dodge pickup, the neighbor whose alibi had held. What investigators found when they pulled the full picture on Ronald Keith Garrett was something that tends to feel, in retrospect, both shocking and inevitable. He had been a quiet man, an unremarkable one to the people who knew him. He'd worked at the depot for 11 years, kept to himself, attended community events without drawing attention, and moved away in 1989 without fanfare. He had settled eventually in Elko, Nevada, where he'd worked as a truck driver and then as a parts supplier for an auto shop, and then, in his later years, had retired to a small house outside of town. He was 73 years old when the call came. The alibi that had protected him for 39 years had been real, as far as it went. Garrett had been on shift at the depot from 7 a.m. on October 3rd. What had never been established, what no one had thought to verify in the original investigation, was that he had left the depot for a personal errand at 6:30 a.m., 30 minutes before his formal shift began. He had been seen by a gate guard, who had not been interviewed because Garrett was not considered a serious suspect at the time. That gate guard was found in 2024. He was 78 and living in Arizona and remembered the morning without difficulty, because it was cold and the gate had been icy and he'd had to chip the latch with a screwdriver. He remembered Garrett's truck. He remembered wondering where a man would be going at 6:30 in the morning in that kind of cold. Route 359 was 5 minutes from the depot gate. The net closed over the course of 3 months. Additional forensic analysis confirmed the palm print on the Buick's door handle as belonging to Garrett. His DNA, obtained through a discarded coffee cup from a gas station in Elko, matched the crime scene profile at a certainty that left no procedural room for argument. On June 14, 2024, members of the Elko County Sheriff's Office and the Nevada Division of Investigation pulled into the driveway of Ronald Keith Garrett's property at 7:22 in the morning. Garrett came to the door in a work shirt and slippers. He looked at the officers. He looked at the warrant. He said nothing that was reported publicly. He was placed in handcuffs and walked to the waiting vehicle. And a neighbor across the road, a woman who had lived there for 20 years and who had once described Garrett to a local reporter as a quiet man, very private, always waved when you drove past, stood on her porch and watched, and did not understand yet what she was watching. Hawthorne understood. The news reached the town in the way that news reaches small towns. Phone calls first, then the local Facebook group, then the Mineral County Sheriff's official statement, then the television trucks from Reno. At the bowling alley, a man who had been in Marla Dean's high school graduating class sat at the bar and stared at his phone for a long time. The clinic where Marla had worked for 7 years closed early that afternoon, not because anyone required it to, but because nobody could concentrate. Dolores Pacheco, 83 years old and sharp as she had ever been, sat in her kitchen in Hawthorne and cried for the first time in years. Not from grief, from something that felt almost like relief, except relief wasn't large enough a word for it. Garrett was charged with first-degree murder. He entered a plea of not guilty. Trial was set for 2025. He ultimately pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for a sentence that, given his age and the length of time elapsed, amounted to the rest of his life in a Nevada State Correctional Facility. He made no public statement. He offered no explanation. He gave the family nothing except the fact of his guilt, admitted at last, 39 years after he had driven down Route 359 in the cold dark before dawn and stopped beside a woman he knew was on her way to work. Roy Dean was 78 years old when Frank Arredondo called him. Arredondo was 84 and had driven to Roy's house to make the call in person, because that was the kind of man Arredondo had always been. They sat in Roy's kitchen, the two of them, and Arredondo read him the name, and Roy sat very still for a moment. He said, "I want to go to the sentencing." He went. He sat in the front row. He did not speak. He had prepared a victim impact statement, written in his own handwriting, and the judge read it into the record. It said, in part, that Marla had loved mysteries and had always wanted to know how things ended. He said he was glad, at last, to be able to tell her. Chester Rivas drove up from Henderson for the sentencing. He sat 3 rows behind Roy Dean. He had not met Roy before that day. Afterward, in the hallway outside the courtroom, the two men shook hands and didn't say much. There wasn't much that needed to be said. The jar of wildflowers still goes to the shoulder of Route 359 every October 3rd. Dolores Pacheco is no longer able to make the drive herself, so her daughter makes it for her. The jar is smaller now, a mason jar, blue glass, the kind that catches the desert light in the afternoon and throws it across the highway in colors that don't have proper names. The clock in Roy Dean's kitchen has been fixed for 30 years. He fixed it the spring after the funeral because he'd finally gotten tired of looking at it. But he has never moved on. That is not a failure. That is what love looks like when it refuses the alternative. Marla Dean was 31 years old. She was the person at the clinic who remembered which elderly patient needed a ride home. She was saving for a piece of land and a few head of cattle and a life she deserved. She checked that brown paper bag the night before, made sure the sandwich was wrapped right. She waved at Roy through the windshield. He waved back. 39 years is a long time to wait for truth. It is not too long. It never becomes too long. That is what the science is teaching us now. Case by case, evidence sample by evidence sample, database match by database match, that the window does not close, that the record does not forget, that sooner or later the desert gives up what it was asked to keep. What do you think justice looks like after 39 years is a sentence that amounts to the rest of someone's life at 73. Enough? What detail in this case stayed with you most? The gate guard, who was never interviewed, the evidence that sat for decades waiting for the right technology, or something else? And what does it say about how we investigate crimes that a retired deputy's letter, written twice over 20 years, was what finally reopened this case? Justice found Marla Dean after 39 years. Stories like hers are why this channel exists. If you believe truth is worth pursuing no matter how long it takes, subscribe. We never run out of cases where someone is still waiting. More are waiting in the description below. Thank you for being here.